The morning Ida Talmadge rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, she carried nothing but a carpet bag, a bone-handled medical kit, and the quiet, unshakable determination of a woman who had already survived more loss than most people saw in a lifetime. She had buried her husband, Thomas, 2 years prior in Abilene, a good man taken too young by a wagon accident on the Kisham Trail, and she had spent those 2 years learning what it meant to be alone in a world that did not make much space for a woman without a man's name attached to hers. She had worked as a nurse's assistant under old Doc Reeves in Abilene, and she had learned more in those 2 years than most trained physicians admitted to knowing. Doc Reeves had told her that herself, right before she packed her carpetbag and kissed his leathery cheek goodbye. Caldwell was a cattle town, raw and loud at its edges and quieter than expected at its center, and Ida took one look at it from the back of the rented horse she had borrowed from the livery station and decided it was the kind of place where she might actually be useful. That was all she asked anymore. Not happiness, not security, not love, just the chance to be useful somewhere. She rented a single room above the dry goods store run by a Mrs. Elspeth Carver, a wide-shouldered woman with a no-nonsense bun, and a warm instinct for people she decided she liked immediately, and Ida decided she liked her back. Mrs. Carver told her there was no proper doctor in Caldwell anymore. The last one, a Dr. Higgins, had moved on to Dodge City in February after a disagreement with the town council over fees. There was a midwife named Pearl Dutton on the south end of town, and a man named Briggs who called himself an apothecary and was mostly a whiskey salesman with a few tinctures on the side. "There is a need here, Mrs. Carver told her plainly, setting a cup of coffee on the table between them. "Whether they will pay you for it or respect it is a different question entirely." "It always is," Ida said, and drank her coffee. She set herself up within a week. The room was too small to properly treat anyone, but Mrs. Carver allowed her use of the large back storage room on the ground floor, and Ida cleaned it out herself, scrubbed the floorboards, hung clean curtains, and brought in a cot and a small table where she could lay her instruments. She posted a hand-lettered sign near the entrance of the dry goods store. Ida Talmadge, nurse and medical care, reasonable fees, all HOURS. The town watched her with the particular wariness reserved for women who did not quite fit where people expected them to be. But the sick and the injured did not care about wariness. And within the first week, she had treated 2 broken fingers, a bad burn from a cooking fire, and a child with croup that had scared his mother half to death. She worked with steady hands and a calm voice and precise knowledge, and word spread the way it always does in small towns, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. It was a Tuesday in late April when she first heard the name Timothy Finley. She heard it from Pearl Dutton, who had stopped in to share a cup of tea and the local news, as Pearl was in the habit of doing every few days. Pearl was somewhere in her mid-50s, a small and energetic woman with sharp eyes and a generous heart, and she had decided she liked Ida from the first week, which Ida was grateful for. "The Finley Ranch is about 6 miles east," Pearl said, warming her hands around her cup. "Timothy Finley. He is a good man. A hard man, but good in the way that the land makes men hard out here. His wife Martha passed 18 months ago, fever that settled in her lungs. There was nothing anyone could do, and believe me, we all tried." Ida nodded, listening. "He has 2 boys. Eli, who is 8, and the little one Sam, who just turned 5. He is raising them alone out there with a ranch hand named Clem Bauer who has been with him for years. He does not come into town much. He handles what he can himself." Pearl paused, turning her teacup. "He is the kind of man who would rather suffer alone than ask for help. You know the type." "I do," Ida said quietly. "I mention it only because you will likely cross paths. He brings the boys in for supplies once a month or so, and he is a good man to have in your corner if you need something in this town. People respect him here." Ida filed the information away the way she filed most things, carefully and without much feeling about it yet, because there was nothing yet to feel. He was simply a name, the shape of a story she had not read yet. She met him 3 weeks later, and it was nothing like she might have expected. She was at the far end of the main street, coming back from the home of a woman named Clara Hewitt, who had needed help with a difficult labor. And Ida was tired down to her bones, with blood on her apron that she had not had time to change, and her dark hair coming loose from its pins in every direction. She was walking with her head down and her carpetbag heavy at her side, and she nearly walked directly into the solid, unmovable wall of a man coming the other direction. She stepped back and looked up, and the first thing she noticed was that he was tall, genuinely tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who worked with their bodies every day, and the second thing she noticed was the look on his face, which was not the usual appraisal she received from men in cattle towns. It was simply steady. Direct, without the usual layer of calculated interest or dismissal that she had learned to brace for. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried. "My apologies. I was not watching where I was going." "Neither was I," Ida said honestly. He looked at her carpetbag, then at the dried blood on her apron, and something shifted in his expression that was not quite concern but was adjacent to it. "Are you hurt?" "No, this belongs to someone else. Clara Hewitt has a healthy son as of about 2 hours ago." Something crossed his face then, a brief, private grief that he smoothed away before it could settle, and she understood without being told that he was thinking of his own wife, of how that had gone differently. "That is good news," he said. "Congratulations to the Hewitt family." "Timothy Finley," Pearl Dutton's voice said from directly behind Ida, and Ida startled slightly because she had not heard Pearl approach. Pearl was standing there with a basket over her arm and a look of comfortable satisfaction, as if she had arranged this encounter herself. "Have you met our new nurse, Ida Talmadge? She has been in Caldwell about a month now." He looked at Ida again, and she saw him take stock of her the way men who were accustomed to reading situations did, not unkindly but honestly. "I had heard," he said. "It is good to have someone here with medical training. We have needed it." "I was sorry to hear about your wife," Ida said, because it seemed the honest thing to say rather than the careful thing. "Pearl told me." A pause. His jaw tightened briefly and released. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was even, but she could hear the cost of the evenness. "It has been some time now. We manage." "Of course you do," Ida said, and she meant it without condescension, and she saw him understand that she meant it that way. They went their separate ways, and Ida did not think about him overly much in the days that followed, because there was too much work to think about anything for long. A cowboy came in from one of the cattle outfits north of town, with a badly infected leg wound that took 2 hours of careful work to clean and dress properly. A little girl swallowed a bead and sent her mother into hysterics. A man named Davies had rheumatism bad enough to keep him bent nearly double, and Ida mixed him a preparation that Doc Reeves had taught her, and told him to rest his joints and drink more water and less rye, which he received with the good humor of a man who had heard the same advice before. She saw Timothy Finley twice more in the following weeks, once at the general store, where he was loading supplies into a wagon while 2 boys who could only be his sons climbed over the wagon bed with the boundless energy of young creatures unaware of any world but their immediate one, and once at the edge of the livery, where he was negotiating with a man over a horse, and she walked past without him seeing her. Each time she saw him, she noticed things about him with the clinical habit of a nurse who observed people for a living. He moved carefully, deliberately, as though he had learned the cost of rushing. He spoke to his sons in a low voice that was different from how he spoke to other men, warmer, more present. He looked tired in a way that sleep did not fix, the kind of tired that came from carrying grief and responsibility both without setting either one down. She noticed. She did not do anything about noticing. She had not come to Caldwell looking for anything except work and ground to stand on. The fever came in the second week of June. It came fast and mean, the way summer fevers sometimes did in Kansas, rolling in like weather from a clear sky. It started with Sam, the younger one, who woke on a Monday morning burning up and coughing with a sound that his father recognized immediately as wrong. By Tuesday morning, Eli had it too, and the fever in both boys was climbing in a way that made the air in the ranch house feel thin and frightening. Clem Bauer, the ranch hand, was the one who rode for Ida. He came pounding into town at a hard gallop and found her already at Mrs. Carver's back room treating a ranch hand's busted hand, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands and his face as white as bleached cloth. "Miss Talmadge," he said, without preamble, "it's the Finley boys, both of them, fever. The little one has been at it 2 days and the older one since yesterday, and it's climbing in them both, and Mr. Finley he said I should come for you." He stopped. He doesn't ask for help easily. He doesn't ask at all, really. So when he said to come for you, I came fast. Ida had already started packing her bag before he finished speaking. She told the man with the busted hand to keep the dressing clean and come back in 2 days, and she was out the door and mounting the horse Clem had brought for her in under 3 minutes. The 6 miles to the Finley ranch felt long and short at the same time, the dry Kansas grassland stretching out flat and golden under the June sun, the sky enormous and indifferent above. Clem rode hard and Ida kept pace with him, her carpetbag strapped across her back, and she spent the ride cataloging what she knew about summer fevers and what she had in her bag and what she might need that she didn't have. She heard the boys before she saw them, not their voices but the charged silence of a house where children were sick, a particular kind of quiet that had its own unmistakable weight. Timothy Finley met her at the door. He was still in his work clothes, as though he had been out in the fields when it started and had never quite made it back to himself. His dark hair was pushed back, and his face was, she found herself searching for the right word and landing on stripped. He looked stripped down to whatever was essential in him, the usual careful distance he kept burned away by 2 days of watching his sons burn. He had dark circles under his eyes that told her he had not slept. "Thank you for coming," he said, and his voice was rough at the edges in a way she had not heard before. "Show me the boys," Ida said, because there was no time for anything else. The boys were in the back bedroom, both in the same bed, because apparently the younger one had refused to be separated from his brother. Sam was indeed the worse of the two, 5 years old and small for his age, curled on his side with his dark hair plastered to his forehead, breathing in quick shallow pulls that Ida assessed immediately as concerning. Eli, 8 and bigger and trying very hard not to look as frightened as he was, lay on his back with his fists clenched at his sides, and his eyes on Ida when she came in with the concentrated scrutiny of a child taking the full measure of a stranger. "Hello," Eli said, in the forced steady voice of someone performing bravery. "You the nurse?" "I am," Ida said, setting her bag on the chair by the bed and opening it. "I am Ida Talmadge. You must be Eli." "Yes, ma'am, and that's Sam. He's sicker than me." "I can see that. You are doing very well, Eli. I need you to keep doing well while I look at your brother first, all right?" "Yes, ma'am," Eli said and relaxed his fist slightly. She examined Sam with quick, thorough hands. The fever was high, dangerously high, the kind that could cause harm if it was not brought down. She listened to his lungs and felt the tightness there with a kind of professional calm that was always separate from the part of her that felt things, and she felt the fear of it clearly while her hands stayed steady and her voice stayed quiet. She examined Eli next and found him in better condition. His fever was significant but not as severe as his brother's, and his lungs were clearer. She worked through the afternoon without stopping. She packed Sam's body in cool, damp cloths that she sent Clem to the well for over and over again, changing them every 20 minutes when the cloths warmed against his hot skin. She gave both boys a preparation of willow bark that Doc Reeves had always sworn by for fever, coaxing it down their throats in small, careful spoonfuls. She mixed a chest poultice for Sam from the mustard powder and other things she had brought and applied it to his thin chest and covered it with a clean cloth. She talked to both boys while she worked, not nonsense, but actual talking, telling them what she was doing and why, treating them like people who deserved to understand what was happening to them. And she saw Eli respond to this with visible relief, while Sam was too far gone in the fever to do much more than make soft sounds. Timothy Finley stood in the doorway for most of it. She was aware of him the way she was aware of everything in a room where she was working, as information, as a variable, as a presence that might be useful or in the way. He did not interfere. He did not ask questions that would have required her to stop and answer. He watched, and when she needed something more water, more cloths, a second lamp lit as the afternoon moved toward evening. He moved to get it before she asked, as if he could read what she needed from the way her hands were moving. It was somewhere around sundown when Sam's fever began to ease. It was not dramatic. It never was. It was just a slow, graduated loosening, the way a storm breaks not at once but in stages, and Ida felt it under her hands when she pressed a fresh cloth to his forehead and found that he did not radiate quite the same terrible heat as before. She checked his breathing and found it slightly easier. She checked his pulse and found it still quick but less frantic. She sat back in the chair beside the bed and let out a breath that she had been holding for a long time. "Is he?" Timothy Finley said from the doorway, and he could not finish the question, which told her everything about what the last 2 days had cost him. "The fever is coming down," she said. "He is not out of it yet. We will need to watch him through the night, but it is moving in the right direction." She heard him breathe. She did not look at him because there are moments that belong to a person privately and should not be witnessed directly, and this was one of them. "Eli's fever is likely to rise again before it breaks," she continued, giving him something to do with the information. "I will keep checking him through the night as well. Is there somewhere you can sleep for a few hours? You will be no use to your boys if you collapse." "I am not sleeping while he started." "A few hours," she said firmly, turning to look at him then. 3 hours, Timothy. Take the cot in the front room. I will wake you if anything changes. I promise you I will wake you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the struggle in it, the part of him that could not let go of the watching, the vigil, the penance that caring for a sick child can feel like. And then something in him gave just slightly, the way a door gives when the right key is used. 3 hours, he said. 3 hours, she confirmed. He went and she turned back to the boys and kept working. She changed the cloths. She checked the temperatures with the back of her hand and with the glass thermometer from her bag. She coaxed more willow bark preparation into Sam when he surfaced briefly from sleep. She sat with Eli when he could not sleep and told him about Abilene and the cattle drives she had seen come through, and he listened with the focused attention of a boy starved for stories, and eventually his eyes grew heavy and he slept. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair between the two boys and she listened to them breathe, and she watched the night outside the small window move from deep black to the blue-gray that preceded dawn. Timothy woke himself after 3.5 hours and came to the doorway looking slightly less like a man about to come apart at the seams, and she gave him a quiet summary and sent him to make coffee, and when he brought her a cup it was stronger than she usually took it, and she drank it gratefully anyway. By the following morning, the crisis had passed. Sam's fever broke properly around sunrise. She was there for it. The moment when the sweat came and the skin cooled, and the child's face relaxed out of the tight, anguished expression of high fever into something that looked, finally, like simple sleep. She checked him over carefully and thoroughly and found, with deep and private relief, that he had come through it without the lasting lung damage she had been afraid of. Eli's fever broke 2 hours later, easier and faster, the way secondary fevers often did when the worst had already passed. She sat back in the chair and she looked at the 2 sleeping boys, and the exhaustion hit her all at once like walking into a wall. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed through it and did not allow herself to crumble, because there would be time for that later. Timothy Finley came to the doorway and she looked at him and simply said, "They are going to be fine." And something happened to his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not a dramatic breaking down, nothing theatrical. It was subtler than that, a single deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere very far down in him, and the very slight trembling of his jaw that he controlled immediately, and the way his eyes were bright for a moment before he made them not be. It was the look of a man who had held himself perfectly rigid for 2 days at the edge of the worst thing he could imagine, and had just been told he could step back from the edge. It was love, she realized. That was what she was seeing. It was what love looked like when it was stripped of everything decorative and left with only its essential bone and marrow. She looked away because he deserved the moment privately. She cleaned up her things and checked the boys one more time and wrote out instructions for their care rest, fluids, light food when they could tolerate it, no returning to normal activity for at least 5 days, and she was to be sent for immediately if any symptoms worsened. And she left the paper on the table beside the bed. Then she went to find her coat and her carpet bag. Timothy Finley was in the main room. He had made more coffee and there was bread on the table, and he said, "Please eat something before you go. You have been here all night." She was going to refuse. She almost refused. But she was genuinely hungry and the bread smelled like it had been made that morning, and she sat down at the rough-hewn table and ate a slice of bread and drank another cup of coffee while he sat across from her and said nothing for a while. "She died of fever," he said eventually. His voice was careful, the way you are careful around something that can still cut you. "My wife, Martha." It was different, it was in her lungs, and by the time it was serious, it was already too late for anything to be done. But when the boys started, he stopped. "I know," Ida said quietly. "I kept thinking." He stopped again. "I know," she said again. She did know. She had known it from the moment Clem Bauer came to her door with his hat crushed in his hands and his face white with a fear that was not just about fever. He looked at her across the table. "How much do I owe you?" She thought about it honestly. Her standard fee for a house call was 50 cents. For an overnight stay with a critical patient, she charged more. She needed to, because she had to live, but she looked at the ranch around her, solid and working but not wealthy, and she thought about 2 boys sleeping in the back room and a man who had ridden the edge of losing everything for 2 days straight. $2, she said. It was fair, even a little low for what it had been. He nodded without argument and went to a tin box on the shelf above the hearth and counted out $2 in coins and set them on the table before her. She put them in her coat pocket. "I will be back tomorrow to check on them," she said, standing. "And the day after. I want to see them through the recovery properly." "I would be grateful," he said. There was something in the way he said it, not just polite, not just transactional, that she held in her mind on the ride back to Caldwell. The June morning was high and bright and the grassland was very green after recent rain, and she let the horse set its own pace, and she thought about the way he had looked at his sleeping sons and about the line of his jaw when he was keeping himself steady. She thought, "He is a good man." She thought, "He is in a great deal of pain." She thought, "Those are not my thoughts to have," and then she set them aside and rode back to Caldwell and went to bed for 5 hours and slept like a stone. She returned to the Finley ranch the next afternoon, and the one after that, as she had promised. Sam was recovering with the vigorous determination of a 5-year-old who did not particularly understand why he was being kept in bed, and protested the injustice of it with increasing energy, which Ida told Timothy was an excellent sign. Eli had developed the typical post-fever appetite, and was eating through the larder at a pace that made his father raise his eyebrows, which Ida told him was also an excellent sign. On her second visit, she arrived to find Sam sitting up in bed with a carved wooden horse in each hand, narrating an elaborate battle to an audience of 1, which was Eli, who had been assigned to keep him company and was managing it with the long-suffering tolerance of an older sibling who had not quite decided whether this was beneath his dignity. "Miss Ida," Sam said when she came in the tone of a person greeting someone he had decided he owned. "Look, Pa made me these." He held up the wooden horses with proprietary pride. "Those are very fine horses," Ida said, taking his temperature and checking his breathing and feeling his glands, all with the brisk cheerfulness she had learned to use with young patients who would cooperate if things were kept moving and interesting. "Pa Whittles," Eli said from his side of the bed, with a studied casualness that was entirely unconvincing as indifference. "He made us lots of things." "I believe it," Ida said. She found Timothy in the barn when she was done with the boys, checking on a mare that had been showing signs of trouble with her fetlock. He straightened when she came in and turned to face her, and she gave him her report in the calm, efficient way she gave all her reports. Sam was recovering very well. Eli was fully himself and could return to light activity. She would come once more in 2 days, and after that only if sent for. He listened to all of it, watching her face. In the dusty golden light of the barn he looked less harrowed than he had 2 days before. Some of the sleeplessness worked out of his face, though there were still shadows under his eyes that spoke of nights that were not entirely restful. "I don't know how to thank you adequately," he said. "You paid me," she said practically. "That covered the medicine and the time," he said. "It doesn't." He paused and seemed to be choosing his words with unusual care. "I have not had reason to trust anyone's medical care since Martha died. I want you to know that you handled my sons with skill and with real care, both things together, and it mattered." It was the longest speech she had heard him make, and she had the sense it had cost him something to make it, and she did not dismiss it or wave it off the way she would have with an easier compliment. "Thank you," she said simply. "That matters to me too." He nodded once. She nodded once. They both turned back to whatever they had been doing, which was suddenly a different kind of quiet. She thought about him on the ride home. She thought about the wooden horses, carved with careful hands in the evenings after his sons were in bed. She thought about the way he had stood in the doorway of that room for all those hours, not sleeping, not moving, just being there in case he was needed. She thought about the word adequate, which was not a word most cattle ranchers reached for. She was 31 years old and she had been a widow for 2 years, and she had not allowed herself to look at a man with anything resembling that kind of interest since Thomas died, because it had seemed beside the point. There had been the work and the grief, and then eventually the work had gotten large enough to fill the space where the grief had been, and that had seemed sufficient. She thought, sufficient is not the same as good. She thought, stop thinking about this. She did not stop thinking about it, which was honest if inconvenient. The third visit was on a Thursday, and Sam was up and racing around the yard with the specific frenetic energy of a child released from bed rest, and Eli was helping Clem with the horses in the way he clearly loved and had missed, and the relief in the whole ranch was almost tangible, like the air after rain. Timothy brought her coffee again, and they sat on the porch while the boys played in the yard. It was different from the hospital quiet of the sick room. It was ordinary and warm, and the June afternoon was perfect, the kind of day that made Kansas feel like a promise rather than a challenge. "How did you come to be a nurse?" he asked, and his voice had lost the careful edge it usually kept in place. He sounded simply curious. She told him about Thomas first, because it was honest to start there. She told him about the 2 years in Abilene, about Doc Reeves, who had been a gifted and generous teacher. She told him about the decision to come to Caldwell, which had been partly practical and partly the instinct that she had followed more than once in her life, the sense that somewhere needed what she had. He listened the way she had already noticed he listened, completely, without the impatience of a man waiting for his turn to speak. "Why do you stay in the West?" he asked. "A woman with your training could work in a city. St. Louis, Kansas City, somewhere with more." He gestured vaguely. "More what?" she asked. "More ease," he said. "Less dust, better supply of everything you need." She looked out at the yard where Sam was attempting to convince Eli to help him catch something in the grass, and at the big sky above the plains, and at the hawks circling lazily over the creek line to the east. "I've thought about it," she said honestly. "But I was born in Ohio and spent time in Missouri, and I came through to Kansas, and I found that I could breathe out here. The bigness of it. She paused. "I know that sounds no," he said. "I understand it exactly." She looked at him, and he was looking at the same landscape she had been looking at, and there was something so aligned about it that it felt like a door opening somewhere. "I was born in Illinois," he said. "Came west when I was 22. My family thought I had lost my mind. Maybe I had. A small sound that was almost a laugh. But I came over the first rise out here and saw the sky, and that was it for me. I never went back." "That was it," she agreed. They sat in comfortable silence after that, and the boys played in the yard, and the afternoon moved around them. She came back twice more over the following 2 weeks, not because it was medically necessary after the boys were fully recovered, but because Timothy had mentioned that Clem Bauer had a persistent cough he would not see to, and then because he had asked her, with the careful casualness of a man who was not sure how a request would be received, if she would mind having a look at a cut on Sam's hand that was slow to heal. The cut on Sam's hand was minor and healed cleanly with a bit of proper attention. The cough, she determined after examining Clem, was irritation from years of dust and smoke, and nothing more serious, though she gave him a preparation for it and a stern lecture about covering his face in heavy dust conditions that he received with the good-natured resignation of a man who knew he would receive the lecture regardless. But the real reason she came back, she admitted to herself on the ride home on that second unnecessary visit, was that she liked being there. She liked the ranch with its rough, beautiful order, and she liked the boys who had rapidly decided she was one of their people, and she was honest with herself. She liked Timothy Finley, who was quiet and steady and intelligent, and who looked at her like she was worth looking at. She rode home through the evening light and told herself to be sensible, and she was sensible, and she kept being sensible for another 3 weeks. What broke the sensibleness was a Saturday in July. She had come to town for supplies, not to the Finley ranch, just to the main street of Caldwell, and she came around the corner of the hardware store and walked directly into the middle of a situation she had not expected, and that made her whole chest clench. 2 men she did not know well, cowboys off one of the large Texas outfits that came through on the drives, had a young man backed against the wall of the hardware store. The young man was Mexican, in his late teens or early 20s, and he was holding a hand to a cut on his face with his eyes down in the particular careful stillness of someone who knew better than to fight back. The cowboys were saying things she was too far away to hear, but the tone of it was unmistakable, and the people on the street were mostly looking away. Ida Talmadge did not look away. She walked directly up to the situation and put herself between the young man and the 2 cowboys with the absolute confidence of someone who has absolutely no patience for this particular species of cruelty. "Step back," she said, and her voice was very clear and very calm in the way that calm can be frightening. "Step back right now. I am a nurse, and this man needs medical attention, and you need to remove yourselves from this space." There was a beat of surprised silence that she had learned to create in moments like this. The pure audacity of a woman speaking into a situation with that much authority tended to create a beat of surprise, and she used it. "Ma'am, this is none of one of them started." "Step back," she said again. She had not moved, had not raised her voice, and she was looking directly at the man who had spoken with the full force of her attention. He was bigger than her and probably stronger, and she knew that, and it did not change anything. Now they stepped back. Not all the way, not graciously, but they stepped back, and she turned to the young man who was watching her with an expression somewhere between gratitude and astonishment, and she said in the same calm voice, "Come with me. I will look at that cut." She walked him to her treatment room without looking back to see what the cowboys were doing, though she was aware they had moved off, probably to find something to say among themselves about difficult women. The young man's name was Ruben Castillo. He was 19, he told her, the son of a vaquero family that had been in the territory since before Kansas was a state, which he said with a quiet dignity that made her think of all the people for whom this land was not new, but from whom it was always being taken in one form or another. His cut was not deep. a split in the skin above his cheekbone that had bled impressively but needed only cleaning and a few days of careful attention. She cleaned it and dressed it and said nothing judgmental and everything practical, and he thanked her with a formality that had real warmth under it and left. She was sitting at her small table writing up her notes when she heard a knock at the back door of Mrs. Carver's store, and she opened it to find Timothy Finley standing there. She was so surprised to see him that she simply stood there for a moment, which was unusual for her. He had obviously been on the main street. He was in town clothes, cleaner than his ranch clothes but just as plain, and he had obviously seen what had happened with the cowboys, because he had the expression of a man who has just watched something that required him to reconsider what he already thought he knew. "I saw what you did," he said. "It was nothing extraordinary," she said, stepping back to let him in, though the space was small and with both of them in it was suddenly much smaller. "No," he said, coming in. "It was not nothing. It took real nerve." He paused. "Those men work for Duggan's outfit. They are not particularly," he seemed to be choosing the polite word, "they are not particularly concerned about the impressions they make." "I noticed," Ida said. "I should have stepped in myself," he said, and there was a real edge of self-criticism in it. "I was farther down the street. By the time I got there, you already had it managed." "It is managed," she said. "Ruben Castillo's cheek will heal fine." He looked at her for a long moment, and the small room was full of the particular quality of attention that had no agenda in it, just genuine looking. "Are you always like that?" he asked. "Like what?" Like, he made a gesture that she understood to mean fearless, certain, immovable, like that. She thought about it honestly. "I am afraid of quite a lot of things," she said, "just not of those particular men." A very small smile. She had not seen him smile before. It changed his face in a way that was interesting to her, not softening it exactly, but lightening something in it, like a window opened. "Ida," he said, and then stopped, as if the use of her given name had startled him slightly, and she felt it also, the small shift of it. He had called her Miss Talmadge before. He had always called her Miss Talmadge. "Timothy," she said carefully. "I wonder," he stopped again, and she saw him gathering something, the way she had seen him gather himself in doorways and at tables, pulling the careful, deliberate parts of himself together around a thought. "I wonder if you might be willing to have supper sometime, with the boys and me, at the ranch." He paused, not as a medical call. She felt something warm move through her that she chose to be honest about. "I would like that," she said. He nodded as if confirming something. "Saturday evening, if that works." "Saturday evening," she agreed. He left, and she sat back down at her table, and she allowed herself, for exactly 3 minutes, to sit with the warm feeling without doing anything practical about it. Then she picked up her pen and went back to her notes. Saturday evening supper at the Finley Ranch was the kind of evening that is made of small things and is, because of that, entirely memorable. Eli had helped make the biscuits and wanted credit for this known up front, which Ida granted immediately and thoroughly. Sam had decided that she should sit next to him, specifically, and negotiated this with the determined authority of a 5-year-old who understood that if you did not state your preferences, clearly someone else would make the decision for you. Timothy had made a beef stew with dried herbs and the particular attentiveness of a man who did not cook elaborately but cooked carefully, and it was very good. The conversation moved easily from the boys' daily disasters and adventures. Sam had gotten into a nest of something, and Eli had attempted a fence repair with mixed results, to the cattle drives coming through Caldwell and the way the town was changing as the trail herds shifted routes, and then, gradually, to the longer things. He told her about Martha. Not with the careful economy he usually used about it, but really told her. A woman who had been from Ohio also, who had come west with him against her family's advice, and had made the ranch what it was with her own hands and her own stubbornness, who had been funny in a dry, particular way that he still sometimes expected to hear, who had been sick for 3 weeks before she died, and who had made him promise in the last week to not let the boys grow up without a woman's care in their lives. She was very practical, he said. Even at the end. She was concerned about the boys, and she was concerned about the south fence, and she was concerned about whether Clem was eating enough vegetables. His voice had the tender, rough quality of someone laughing and grieving simultaneously. She was the least dramatic person I have ever met. She sounds remarkable, Ida said, and meant it. She was, he said simply. Eli and Sam had fallen asleep on the rug in front of the hearth at some point during the after-supper conversation. Eli with his arm around his brother, in an unconscious protectiveness that made something tight in Ida's chest. Timothy looked at them and then looked at her, and the look was unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, as if the evening had worn down the careful external parts and left something more essential. "I should go," she said softly, not wanting to, but aware of the hour and the 6 miles and the propriety of a thing. "I will have Clem ride back with you," he said immediately. "I have made that ride half a dozen times," she said. "I know you have." "He will ride back with you anyway." She looked at him with the beginning of a smile. "All right." He walked her out to the horse, and the night was enormous and star-filled, the kind of Kansas night sky that always made her feel very small in the most beautiful possible way. He held the horse while she mounted, and when she had the reins he looked up at her, and the starlight made his face all plains and shadow. "I am glad you came to Caldwell," he said. It was simple, and it was true, and it was completely unembellished, and she felt it settle in her like something that had been waiting to settle. "So am I," she said. She rode home with Clem 20 yards behind her, and the stars overhead, and her heart doing something that she had not felt it do in a very long time, something hopeful and fragile and entirely alive. The summer moved forward with the slow, gathering quality of something that has not announced itself yet, but is building. She came to the ranch for supper twice more in July, and once Timothy brought the boys into town on a Saturday, and they all 4 walked the main street together, stopping at the dry goods store for penny candy at the boys' insistence, and at the livery to look at a new horse that Eli pronounced excellent, and at the small church at the end of the road, where the Ladies' Aid Society was holding a summer social, and they stopped to be sociable. And Ida was aware, with a quiet internal note, that several people watched the 4 of them together with the particular attention of a town that notices when its people are arranging themselves into new configurations. Pearl Dutton found her Monday morning. Pearl had a gift for appearing exactly when something needed to be said, and she sat down across from Ida with her teacup and her sharp eyes and said, "The whole town is talking." "About what?" Ida asked, though she knew. "About you and Timothy Finley and those boys who apparently have told half the children in Caldwell that Miss Ida is their friend." Pearl said this with a warmth that was entirely without malice. "People think well of it. I want you to know that. He has been alone a long time, and those boys need, well, everyone can see what those boys need." She paused. "I want you to know that if it is heading where it appears to be heading, people here will think well of it." "Pearl," Ida said carefully. "I am not meddling," Pearl said. "I am informing. There is a difference." Ida thought about the difference and decided it was smaller than Pearl believed, but she was also grateful for it, and she said so, which made Pearl smile with great satisfaction. It was in August that things shifted into something she had no more practical language for. She had come to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, a real medical call this time, because Sam had gotten a splinter deep into his palm that had begun to show signs of infection, and Timothy had sent Clem for her. And she had dealt with the splinter with a needle, and her reading glasses and Sam's determined attempt to be brave about it, which eventually gave way to crying, and then to the blissful relief of the infected pressure being released, and then to the business of a proper bandage, and instructions for cleaning it twice daily. Sam had fallen asleep against her arm sometime during the bandaging, worn out from the crying and the relief, and she had sat very still so as not to wake him, and Timothy had come in from outside and found them like that, his small son curled asleep against the nurse's arm with his bandaged hand held carefully in her lap. He stood in the doorway and she looked up at him, and neither of them said anything. and in the silence, something was established between them that had no name yet but was entirely real. He came to sit across from her at the table, and they spoke in low voices so as not to disturb Sam, talking about nothing important, the price of cattle at the market in Wichita, the new preacher who had come to Caldwell, whether the late summer was going to be as dry as the previous year, and the conversation was entirely surface level and was not at all what either of them was talking about. What they were talking about underneath was, what is this, and where is it going, and do you feel it too? He walked her out when Sam had been laid down properly and the evening was beginning, and he walked her farther than usual past the barn, toward where the land opened into a long, low field that caught the evening light beautifully, and they walked without needing to talk, which was its own kind of statement. "I need to tell you something," he said eventually. She waited. "I have not," he stopped, tried again. "Since Martha, I have not allowed myself to another stop." She had never heard him be this inarticulate, and it was somehow more expressive than anything fluent would have been. "I did not think I would want to again, any of it." He looked out at the field. "The boys are the whole of it for me. They are all that matters, and for a long time that felt like enough, and then, she said quietly. He turned to look at her, and the evening light was amber and warm on his face, and the look in his eyes was the same one she had seen in the sick room, stripped down and honest, and completely without the armor he usually kept in place. "And then you walked into my house in the middle of the worst 2 days I have had since I lost Martha," he said. "And you stayed all night, and you took care of my sons, and you talked to them like they were worth talking to, and I watched you, and I thought that was what it looked like." He paused. "What it was supposed to look like, what I had with Martha, and I thought I was never going to see it again." Ida stood very still. "I am not," he made a rough sound. "I am saying this badly." "No," she said, "you are saying it perfectly." He looked at her with an expression that was partly relief and partly the specific vulnerability of a private man who has said something he cannot unsay. "I lost someone too," she said. He was a good husband and I loved him, and losing him broke something in me that took a very long time to put back together. And I came here and I threw myself into the work because the work was something I could hold on to, and that was fine. That was enough." She paused. "I told myself that was enough." "Was it?" he asked. She thought of the ride home under the stars. She thought of Sam asleep against her arm. She thought of the way it felt to sit on this man's porch in the summer evening and have nowhere else she wanted to be. "No," she said honestly. "It was not enough." He reached out and very slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who had thought very carefully about what he was doing, he took her hand. His hand was large and rough-palmed from ranch work and warm, and she felt the warmth of it go all the way up her arm and settle in her chest. They stood in the evening light in the field and held hands, and nothing more dramatic than that happened, and it was the most significant thing that had happened to her in 2 years. "I would like to court you properly," he said, still looking at the field, "if you are willing." She squeezed his hand once deliberately. "I am willing," she said. He looked at her then, and she looked back at him, and they both understood each other completely. He courted her carefully and thoroughly over the following 6 weeks, the way a deliberate man does things, with patience and with attention to detail, and with a seriousness that she had always found, even as a young woman, more compelling than any amount of charm. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bank that he said the boys had specifically voted on, which made her smile every time she thought about it. He came to town to walk with her on Sunday afternoons when his work allowed it, and he asked her questions about the things she knew and listened to the answers with real interest. And he told her about the ranch and about Illinois and about his father who had been a good man and about the things he was trying to build out here. The boys were, as Pearl had noted, ahead of the situation. Sam had simply incorporated Ida into his understanding of the world with the uncomplicated thoroughness of a small child, and called her Miss Ida in the tone of a person discussing family. Eli was more thoughtful about it, the way 8-year-olds can be more watchful and more careful than adults expect, and there was a period of a few weeks where he studied her with the concentrated assessment of someone making an important decision. She did not push it. She simply continued to be what she was: honest, interested, caring, and one afternoon when she was at the ranch and Eli was reading at the table with his tongue between his teeth, he looked up from his book and said, without preamble, "Are you going to marry my pa?" She was very glad she was not holding anything breakable. She set down the cloth she was folding and looked at Eli with the respect he deserved. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "Your father and I are getting to know each other. Why do you ask?" Eli seemed to be weighing something. "Sam wants you to," he said. "He told me so." "What do you want?" she asked. Eli looked back at his book for a moment, then back up at her. "I think you would be good for Pa," he said in the very careful voice of an 8-year-old being diplomatic but meaning something deeper. He worries a lot, since Ma. And when you're here he doesn't worry as much." He paused. "I notice things." "You do," Ida said. "You notice very well." Eli nodded with satisfaction and went back to his book, apparently satisfied that the matter had been addressed. She told Timothy about it that evening on the porch after the boys were in bed, and something in his face went through several emotions so quickly she could only catch the beginning and end of it: startled, then moved, then quietly, privately happy in a way that sat well on him. "He notices things," Timothy agreed in a voice that was very fond. "He does," Ida said, "and what he noticed was right." Timothy turned to look at her. The September evening was cooling now, the long Kansas summer finally beginning to ease at its edges, and there were stars starting in the eastern sky. "You mean the worrying less part?" "I mean all of it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Ida," he said. "Yes. I want to say something, and I want to say it right, so I need you to give me a moment." She turned to face him, and she waited. He was quiet for a long time, and in the quiet she could hear the night sounds of the ranch, the horses settling, an owl somewhere distant, the creak of the porch wood. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and true. "You came into our lives in the worst possible moment," he said. "You came when I was terrified and alone and not sure my sons were going to be all right, and you walked in and you took care of them like they were worth everything, and they are." And he stopped and started again. "I have watched you since then. I have watched you be good and capable and brave and honest and kind, and I have watched my boys love you, and Ida, I have fallen in love with you." He said it plainly, without decoration, the way he said everything that mattered. "I did not plan to, and I did not go looking for it, and I would not change it for anything." The stars were fully out now. The night was very large and very still around them. "Timothy," she said, and her voice was not as steady as she would have liked it, but she did not mind. "I have fallen in love with you too. I have been trying to be sensible about it for 2 months, and I have completely failed." He made the small sound that was his laugh again, the one she had been collecting. Then he reached out and took her face in both his rough, careful hands and kissed her, which was the single most deliberate and gentle kiss she had ever experienced. And she put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heart beating fast under the cotton of his shirt. And she thought, "There it is. There is what I was looking for without knowing I was looking." When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers and they both simply breathed. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I have been working up to it." "Then ask," she said. And he said, "Will you marry me?" And she thought about the wildflowers and the strong coffee and the boys asleep on the rug, and the way he had held her hand in the field, and the way he had looked at her when she told him his sons were going to be fine. And she thought about Ohio and Abilene and Thomas, who had been good and was gone, and the way grief could turn, eventually, slowly, into something more like gratitude for what it showed you about your own capacity to love. "Yes," she said. He held her in the dark of the porch, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely and simply at home. They were married in the first week of October, in the small white church at the end of Caldwell's Main Street, and it was not a large wedding because neither of them wanted a large wedding, but the people who mattered were there. Pearl Dutton sat in the front row and cried with entirely unself-conscious happiness. Mrs. Carver attended with what she called appropriate composure, but which was clearly also emotion. Clem Bauer stood at the back in his best hat, looking uncomfortable and pleased. Sam sat through the ceremony with extraordinary self-restraint until the moment that Timothy and Ida exchanged their vows, at which point he could not entirely help himself and said in a carrying whisper, "That means she's our ma now," to Eli, who replied in an equally carrying whisper, "I know, Sam," and the entire small church heard it, and the reaction was immediate and warm, and several people who had been successfully keeping their composure stopped managing it. Ida heard both of them. She looked down at the two boys in their good shirts sitting in the front pew, Sam bouncing slightly with contained excitement, and Eli watching her with his measuring eyes, and something behind them that was not guarded any more but openly glad, and she felt tears on her face before she knew she was crying. Timothy saw them and reached up and brushed one away with his thumb, and he was smiling, really smiling, the smile that changed his whole face, the one she had decided when she first saw it that she wanted to keep seeing, and he said, very quietly so only she could hear it, "Good tears or bad tears?" "The very best kind," she said. They said the words, and the minister said the words, and it was done, and she was Ida Finley, which took some getting used to, and which she decided, privately, she was very happy about. The wedding supper was at the ranch, because that was where everything important happened for them, and Pearl and Mrs. Carver and a half-dozen others came out, and there was food and music from a fiddle player named Amos, who was missing 2 fingers but played beautifully anyway, and Sam danced with the absolute dedication of someone who has never danced before and is committing completely, which involved a great deal of spinning and very little actual musicality, and was the best thing Ida had ever watched. Later, after the guests had ridden back and the boys were in bed, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark Kansas night and felt the ranch settle around her like something she already knew. Timothy came to stand behind her, and he put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and they looked out together at the dark. "How is it," he asked quietly, "being here, properly here?" She considered it honestly. The rooms that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the particular lived-in scent of a house where children had grown. The scratches on the floor from years of boots and boys and working life. The view from every window of the enormous prairie sky. "Like something I have been heading toward," she said, "without knowing that was where I was heading." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "That is exactly how it feels," he said. She turned to face him and took his face in her hands the way he had taken hers on the porch, and she looked at him in the low lamplight. He looked at her back, and there was nothing in his face that was guarded or far away. He was entirely there, entirely present, entirely hers, and she was his, and that was the whole of it. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. They had, between them, earned every word of it. She kept her practice going. It had always been important to her that she was not only a wife and a mother but a nurse, and Timothy had never had any question about this. He had said, matter-of-factly, when they first talked about it, that Caldwell needed her, and that was that, and she had loved him for the plain, uncomplicated support of it. Mrs. Carver kept the back room available to her for morning hours, and Ida rode into town 4 days a week, sometimes 5. And the ranch and the children and the house arranged themselves around this without complaint. The boys adapted to her presence in the house, with the general ease of children who had already decided they wanted the thing. Sam's adaptation was immediate and total. He began calling her Mama within the first week, as naturally as breathing, and she heard it the first time from across the yard, and had to turn away and press her hand to her mouth because she was not going to cry in front of the chickens. Eli took longer, not out of resistance but out of the thoughtful care he brought to everything, and she waited without pressure, and about 3 weeks after the wedding he came and found her in the kitchen and said, "Mama, can I have a biscuit?" Without any preceding announcement that he was going to say it, and she turned around and said, "You can," and handed him one, and neither of them made anything of it, and it was perfect. The first winter as a married woman at the Finley Ranch was the hardest and the best thing she had known in years. Kansas winters were ungentle. The wind came down from the north with a flatland ferocity that had nowhere to spend itself, and the cold settled in hard. She learned the specific rhythms of ranch life in winter, the extra care of the animals, the firewood situation that was a constant negotiation, the way the boys had to be kept occupied on the long indoor days or the energy found its own less desirable outlets. She learned the sounds the house made in high wind, and which of the windows let in a draft and what to do about it, and which of Timothy's silences were comfortable, and which meant something was on his mind that she should ask about. She also learned in January that she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told him, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she wanted to hold it alone for a little while, this thing that was new and theirs, and not yet shared. She confirmed it with the confidence of her medical training, and sat with it in the early mornings before anyone else was awake, drinking her coffee at the kitchen table with the knowledge warming her from the inside. She told him on a Sunday evening when the boys were in bed, sitting by the fire with their respective reading. She simply looked up from her book and said, "Timothy, we are going to have a child." He looked up from his book and looked at her, and she watched the understanding travel across his face, first the plain reception of the information, then the meaning of it, then something that was unqualified and complete joy, the kind that a person cannot entirely contain in their face and does not try to. He set down his book and came across to her and took her hands and said nothing for a moment. "When?" he finally managed. "Late summer, I believe," she said. "August, perhaps." He looked at her hands in his and then up at her face, and his eyes were bright in the firelight. How are you feeling?" "Perfectly well," she said. "I am a nurse. I know every single thing that may happen, and I am the least worried person in this room about it." "The least worried," he said, and his voice was rough with feeling. "I am going to worry a great deal." "I know," she said fondly. "You can worry and I will be practical. We are very well suited." He laughed then and pulled her against him, and she went, and the fire crackled and the wind moved against the windows, and outside the Kansas winter was as cold as it always was, and inside she was warm. She told the boys the next evening after supper, with Timothy sitting at the table and watching. Sam received the information with a brief, explosive, "A baby," and then spent the next 20 minutes asking logistical questions about the baby, with the single-minded intensity of a 5-year-old determining the complete parameters of a new situation, including whether the baby would need his bedroom, and whether the baby would be a boy or a girl, unknown, and whether he could hold the baby immediately when it arrived, yes, carefully, and whether the baby would know who he was right away, probably not immediately, she explained. And he looked personally offended by this. Eli said, "That's good," in his careful, considered way, and then, after a pause, "Can I help you with things? When you're tired?" "You can," she said, "and I will need it." "Thank you, Eli." He nodded with satisfaction, and she looked across the table at Timothy and found him watching the whole exchange with the expression she had come to think of as his most genuine one, the quiet, full, private happiness that he kept mostly to himself, but that she had learned to read in the small signs of it. Spring came, and she kept working through the first months of the pregnancy, because there was no reason not to, and because the people of Caldwell still needed her. Pearl Dutton kept a close eye on her, a role that Pearl clearly felt was her natural due, and which Ida accepted with more gratitude than she always let on. The town had continued to grow around her, and she had become as integral to it as any other fixed point. People brought her their injuries and their fevers and their difficult births and their chronic conditions, and she handled them all with the same careful competence, and they trusted her the way people trust a person who has proven themselves time and again. Reuben Castillo had become, over the months since that July afternoon, a regular and welcome figure at the clinic. He had a gift for medicine that she had recognized early, an instinct for observation and a steady hand and a genuine desire to understand. And she had started, gradually and then deliberately, teaching him. He came 3 mornings a week and she showed him everything she knew, the practical and the theoretical both, and she told him directly and honestly that the obstacles he would face in pursuing this formally were real and unjust, and that she was going to help him however she could. He received this with the dignity he brought to everything and said, "Miss Ida, Mrs. Finley, I know how this territory works. I know what it takes." And she said, "I know that you know, and I am still going to help." Timothy had met Reuben and liked him, which did not surprise her but gratified her, and the two of them had a particular kind of tacit mutual respect that required very few words and seemed to operate entirely satisfactorily on that basis. Summer was hot and full, and by July Ida was substantial with child and not entirely comfortable in the Kansas heat, which she bore with the practical stoicism of a woman who did not believe in complaining about things she had chosen and understood. She continued to see patients through the first week of August, when Pearl Dutton appeared at the clinic door and put her foot down with a firmness that impressed even Ida, and Ida spent the last weeks of summer at the ranch being attended to, which was deeply unfamiliar, and which she eventually managed to accept with only moderate resistance. The baby came on a Tuesday evening in late August, and Pearl Dutton delivered him with the experience of a woman who had brought hundreds of children into the world, and the particular tenderness she saved for people she loved. It was a boy. He was red and vigorous, and announced his arrival with a confidence that suggested he was going to be fine at making himself known in the world. Timothy held him in the first minutes after the birth with the kind of careful reverence that big hands can have with very small things, and looked down at his face as if the world had just rearranged itself into a new configuration. "What do we call him?" Ida asked from the bed, exhausted and clear-eyed and very happy. Timothy looked up at her. "What do you want to call him?" She had thought about this. "I was thinking Daniel," she said, "but the middle name is yours to choose." He looked back at the boy. "Daniel James Finley," he said after a moment. James had been his father's name. "Daniel James Finley," she agreed. Eli and Sam had been kept in the front room with Clem during the birth, and when Pearl opened the door and told them they could come in, Sam arrived at approximately the velocity of a small comet, and Eli followed 2 steps behind with slightly more dignity and considerably less success at hiding his excitement. Sam looked at the baby with his eyes very wide and very serious, and then looked at Ida with an expression that was entirely overwhelming in its sincerity. "Mama," he said, "he is very small." "He is," she agreed. "He will get bigger." Sam nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and turned back to studying Daniel with the concentrated attention of a person filing away all available information. Eli stood by the bed and looked at his new brother with the same measuring stillness he brought to everything important, and then looked at Ida, and in his face she saw the same thing she had seen the first night of the fever, fear and hope and love, unguarded, real. "Is he all right?" Eli asked. "And are you all right?" "We are both entirely all right," she said. "Come and look at him properly." He came and looked, and she saw the thing happen in him that happens to people when they meet someone new who belongs to them, the recognition, the sudden rearrangement of the internal landscape to include a new room. "He has Pa's nose," Eli said, with the judicial certainty of an expert. "He does," Timothy agreed from the other side of the bed, and looked at Ida over the baby's head with his quiet, full smile. She had one more thing that wanted saying, and she said it in the quiet of the room after Pearl had gone and Clem had taken the boys back to their own beds, and it was just the 3 of them, her, and Timothy, and Daniel James, who was sleeping with the profound commitment of the newly arrived. "I want you to know," she said, "that when I rode into Caldwell with my carpetbag and my medical kit and my plan to be useful and nothing else, I did not know what I was riding toward. I thought I knew what I needed." She looked at her husband in the lamplight, at his kind, tired face with the lines of the years and the land on it. "I was wrong about what I needed. What I needed was this." He reached across and took her hand. "So was I," he said. I thought I had my boys and my land and that was the whole of my life. I thought that was all right. Was it all right? She asked, smiling. It was not enough, he said simply, returning her own words to her. And now it is. The years that followed were the kind that do not make for dramatic stories but make for full lives. Daniel grew with the speed common to healthy children, and before Ida had quite adjusted to him being there, he was walking, and then talking, with great enthusiasm and a very individual approach to the sequence of words, and then running, which he did with the same focused determination he seemed to bring to everything physical. He had Timothy's dark hair and Ida's gray eyes and Sam's high energy and Eli's stubbornness, and was in general a force of considerable local significance. Sam, who had been so concerned about the baby from the beginning, turned out to be an extraordinary older brother, patient and inventive, and genuinely interested in small Daniel's development, in a way that made Ida wonder sometimes if he too might end up drawn to the caring professions. He watched the way she worked with an interest that was not unlike the way Reuben Castillo watched her, which she filed away and did not push. Eli grew into the steady, thoughtful young man he had always been becoming, with an increasingly clear talent for the land itself, for reading weather and soil, and the behavior of animals, and the long, patient work of building something durable. He was 12 when Daniel was born, and by 14, he was doing real work on the ranch, not as a child helping but as someone with genuine skill and judgment. And Timothy looked at him sometimes with a particular pride that was almost painful in its completeness. Reuben Castillo, in the fall of 1882, boarded a train for Kansas City with a letter of recommendation from Ida to a physician she had corresponded with there, a man named Dr. Arlen, who ran a medical college and had more progressive ideas than most about who was entitled to training. It was not easy, and she knew it would not be easy, and she had prepared him for that reality, and so had he prepared himself. And she saw him off at the Caldwell station, with a handshake that conveyed everything she could not say about the particular injustice of a world that made his path harder than it needed to be, and the equal certainty that he had every capacity to walk it. He wrote to her from Kansas City twice a year, letters with increasingly confident medical language and occasional observations about the city that made her smile. In the letter she received in the spring of 1883, he wrote that he had been admitted to the training program and that he intended to return to the territory when he was done, and that he thought there was a great deal of work to be done for the families and communities that had been here longest and had the least access to medical care. She read the letter to Timothy over coffee, and he said, without any irony, "Good man," and she agreed completely. She and Pearl Dutton had been working for 2 years by 1883 on what they called, informally, the Women's Medical Aid, and organized effort to ensure that women in and around Caldwell had access to medical care that was competent and compassionate, and did not require them to travel far or pay more than they could afford. It was unofficial, and it was underfunded, and it operated on determination and the network of trust that Pearl had been building for decades, but it served real need, and she was proud of it in the way she was proud of all things that were built with hands and persistence. Timothy supported all of it, the women's work, the practice, Reuben's correspondence, the running battle with the town council about whether there should be a proper medical facility rather than a back room in a dry goods store, with the same uncomplicated steadiness he had brought to everything from the beginning. He did not make speeches about any of it. He simply made it possible, with the practical application of his influence in the town and his labor on the ranch and his presence at her side. In the late spring of 1883, she told him she was expecting again. This time she told him directly and immediately, sitting at the breakfast table before the boys were up, and he looked at her across the coffee cups with the same uncomplicated full joy as the first time, and she thought, some people are exactly the same in the important moments, again and again, and it is a deeply beautiful quality. The baby arrived in December in the hard heart of winter and was a girl. They named her Clara, for no reason more complicated than that they both heard the name and felt it was right. And she came into the world with dark eyes that would eventually turn hazel, and a disposition that announced itself immediately as a preference for being carried, which she communicated clearly and without any ambiguity. Sam, who was 9 by then, and had appointed himself the official authority on babies on the basis of having assisted at Daniel's arrival, received Clara with great solemnity and immediately told Daniel, who was 3, and had complicated feelings about no longer being the youngest, that it was now their responsibility to look out for her. Daniel, after consideration, appeared to accept this assignment. Eli, 16 and now too old to express excitement without qualification, held Clara in his arms with the careful correctness of someone who has never held a baby before, and looked at her with an expression of complete private wonder that he clearly believed no one was witnessing, and Ida witnessed it from across the room and loved him very much. The winter settled around the ranch with its usual severity, and the 5 children, for Ida had come to think of Eli as her own in every way that mattered, were contained under one roof with the specific dynamics of a household where the ages ranged from infant to 16, and the energy budget was always in deficit. She managed all of it with the same competence she brought to the medical work, and she and Timothy moved around each other in the rooms of the house with the particular grace of people who have learned each other's rhythms thoroughly and found them compatible. There were hard things, too, in those years, as there always are. There was the summer of the drought when the creek ran down to nothing, and the grazing was poor, and they were tight in a way that required real decisions. There was a winter illness, not the fever of that first June, nothing like that, but a bad respiratory season that took 2 older residents of the area and reminded everyone that the land was not sentimental. There was the ongoing negotiation with a world that did not always make space for the things she cared about, the women's medical work, Reuben's path, the general principle that every person deserved competent care regardless of what they could pay. But the hard things were met together, which made them manageable, and the good things were shared, which made them more than themselves. On an evening in the spring of 1884, she was sitting on the porch with Timothy as she had sat with him 100 times before, the stars coming in over the eastern grassland, the day winding down around them, the sounds of the ranch in the middle distance, and she thought about the morning she had ridden into Caldwell 5 years ago with her carpetbag and her bone-handled medical kit and her determination to be useful. She thought about Clem Bauer arriving at her door with his hat crushed in his hands and his face white, and the 6-mile ride through the golden morning to this place. She thought about 2 small boys in a shared bed with their fevers burning. She thought about standing at a window at dawn watching Sam's fever break, and the way Timothy's face had looked in the sick room doorway when she told him his sons were going to be fine. She thought about a man standing at her door months later with shaking hands and a quiet question, asking her to supper, not as a medical call, just as a man asking a woman to share an evening with his family, because he had run out of reasons to pretend he did not want to. She thought everything came from that. All of it came from the fever and the long night and the morning after, when 2 people who had both been surviving on their own for too long recognized something in each other that was worth the considerable risk of hope. "You are thinking hard," Timothy said beside her. "I am always thinking hard," she said. About how things start," she said, "the specific moments. How from one night and one question everything else can grow." He was quiet, and she knew he was following the same thread of thought because he always knew where she was, or she always knew where he was, and 5 years of a shared life had made the difference between those 2 things negligible. "I was terrified," he said quietly. "When I came to ask you to supper, I stood at the door of Mrs. Carver's store for longer than I should have." She looked at him. "You hid it very well." "I was extremely determined to hide it," he said, with a self-awareness that was fond and rueful. "I had my hands in my coat pockets so you wouldn't see them shaking." She laughed, and the sound of it went out into the spring night. "I suspected," she admitted. "I know, I could tell you suspected. That made it worse." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the warm, easy silence that had been the constant foundation of everything they had built. And the stars came fully in over Kansas, and the ranch settled around them in the dark with its horses and its children and its years of worked earth. And she was, she thought, precisely where she was supposed to be. Inside, she could hear the particular sound of Sam attempting to prevent Daniel from doing something inadvisable, and Daniel's creative counterarguments, and the periodic authoritative contribution of Eli, who was old enough to play referee and young enough to enjoy the authority of it. Clara was asleep, she knew, because the baby's silence had a specific character she had already learned to read. Everything was accounted for. Everything was, at this specific moment, perfectly whole. "Timothy," she said. "Ida," he said, in the tone of a man who knows he is about to be told something important and is ready for it. "I want you to know," she said, "that this is the best thing, all of it. The boys and the ranch and the practice and the work and you, this is the best thing in my life." He pressed a kiss to her hair. His arm was solid and warm around her shoulders. "Mine too," he said, "every single day of it." They sat together while the night deepened, and the stars grew brighter, and the Kansas spring moved around them with its full, large beauty, and the life they had made from one fever and one shaking question was all around them, breathing in cribs and bickering in back rooms and sleeping in barns and growing in ways they could already see and ways they could not yet imagine. And it was good, and it was real, and it was entirely, completely enough. More than enough. The thing it had always been supposed to be.